Welcome to Continuing Conversations, a podcast presented by the VCU Office of Continuing and Professional Education. My name is Connor Lobb, and on this show, I'll be interviewing different leaders in the field of continuing education. This week, my guest is Jan Williamson, lead instructor of the VCU OCPE Play Therapy Program and clinical supervisor and mental health clinician who provides trauma-informed mental health services for the nonprofit agency Child Savers here in Richmond, Virginia. We'll be talking about her career in mental health and the ins and outs of play therapy. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Okay, and here I am with Jan Williamson. Jan, so happy to have you on the podcast this week. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in practicing play therapy?
Sure. Thanks, Connor. I'm Jan Williamson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and also a registered play therapist and play therapist supervisor. And I came to the field wanting just to practice therapy. So I have a master's in clinical psychology and a master's in clinical social work, which prepared me just for the therapeutic side of it. And I've done quite a bit of community-based work. So I started working with adults, primarily adults in emergency settings. I worked out of the country for about 12 years with refugee populations. And of course, that was very much at the emergency trauma level. So when I came back to the States, I ended up working with adults with traumatic histories. And of course, that leads to a lot of talking about childhood trauma. So working with adults initially sort of led me then into working with younger and younger and younger adults until I was working with children, actually.
Okay. So when you were overseas, you were providing like therapeutic treatment to refugees or overseas, is what you were saying?
Right, at the emergency level, at the camp level, people who had been displaced had crossed borders, come across the border, were displaced from their own countries or in war zones. In the refugee camps that were set up. We provided initially care for unaccompanied children. And then once we set up basic care, we started looking at psychological issues and just needs of kids within that community. Probably the largest refugee camp I worked in was in Khao Dang on the border at Thailand, or a little ways from the border, back in 1979. And we at one point it was a city of 150,000 refugees. It was like a small city set up in tents. And we had about 1,200 children who'd been separated from families and from family members, and we're providing group care for them in that setting over a period of time.
That could be like a whole other podcast episode in and of itself. That sounds very intense.
Yeah.
So it's kind of how you got your start in a way. So I think probably maybe not most, but people might not know what play therapy is who are listening to this podcast. So could you tell us just sort of like what play therapy is and what it seeks to accomplish?
Sure, that's a good place to start. We talk about talk therapy with adults. You come to see an adult therapist, you sit down in the chair, you talk, you begin to give history, identify issues you want to talk about, and that's all done through cognitive level or, through our verbal communication. So with kids, their medium isn't necessarily talk therapy. It's through play. And, play basically we say is the language of children. It's also basically their work. They're going out to play each day, but the play has a real serious purpose. They're playing out what's going on around them in the world. They're trying on. We look at 3 or 4-year-olds that are, sweeping the floor or fixing the car or delivering the mail or playing grocery store or playing teacher. They're trying out roles that they see other adults in their world doing. So it's a very serious business, although it's done through the medium of play. Just how kids interact with each other, how they connect with the world around them. And it's almost like in therapy, you're looking for kids who that's disrupted. They're not reaching out to the world. They're not interacting with the world around them. We know something's pretty seriously wrong, if they're shut down to the point that they're not interacting with the world around them, because that's how they're getting all their information. Little kids early on are just like little human sponges of information that they're taking in, about the physical world, emotional, biological, cognitive world. That's how they're getting everything and coming into this little body and just beginning to develop and figure out how to navigate through the world, how they do interactions with people and social connections. It's all wired in through child development. So play truly is the medium that kids work with. So that's why we start with play.
And so, like, how do you use play to reach them in a similar way that you would use talk therapy to reach an adult then?
In play therapy, we have, of course, lots of toys, lots of items in the room. Everything in a play therapist's office, it may look pretty chaotic, like it's just full of all kinds of fun toys, but everything in there has sort of a therapeutic purpose. And there's just a large variety of items that are set out, sort of invite kids into play. And if you just leave a child alone, you can invite them in and say, in here, you can play with anything you want to. There's something you can't do, I'll let you know. And that's kind of your opening line to a child in child-centered play therapy. And they'll begin to interact with things that are in the room. And then usually they're kind of off and running at that point. And then we're sort of watching what they do. I tend to work a lot with sand tray, a particular medium of an actual box of sand, sand that's up on a tray. And then I have a lot of miniatures all over the office that they can select from to sort of create a world. So kids, once they get into that, will create a lot of objects, animals, people, items, nature, anything I could think of. There's different categories in the room, and they'll create a scene from that. And just like adults, something serious happens to us, something sort of traumatic. I mean, if you get into a fender bender on the way to work, when you get to work, what's the first thing you do? You tell everyone about it. You won't believe what happened to me.
Yeah.
that guy just ran right into the back of my car. And we're telling it over and over again during the day. And that's how we, as humans, that's how we process information verbally. So kids are going to do the same thing. They may not use words to do it, but in the play, they'll play it out over and over again. It's how they figure out how to process something that's going on in the world that they may not understand, is they'll try out different arrangements, different, toys that they're using, different mediums to try. They'll try on different emotions in different situations, and they'll, quote, play it out, but they're really working out some pretty serious issues at times.
So it's almost like in talk therapy, you want to get the person to sort of like work it out for themselves, what's going on in a way. And with a kid, you want them to sort of act out and play out what the issue is that they're dealing with, so you can identify it and then maybe talk to the parent about it or something like that.
Right. That's a good part of it, or a big part of it. With kids, it's like if you work things out therapeutically, your therapist might say a word or two here or there, or make an observation, and we'll do the same with kids. I think the difference with kids, you have to really learn first how to be quiet, how to sit, and then let them take the lead in the play, because kids are very influenced, by the adults around them, even when they're just trying to do, even when they're relatively healthy and trying to do what we say. If I say something about, wow, I really love that scene you just created with all those trees, I'm kind of gearing that kid then to try to do another scene with trees because I really liked it. It's kind of with my voice and my praise, I'm targeting something they did. And in therapy, we want to step back and let them play out what they need to play out without our influence on it. So I'd say something different about, they say, look at all these trees I put in the sand tray. Wow, you used all the trees in the sand tray, and just kind of leave it at that, kind of use my voice to encourage them, but not direct them in any way. And we're kind of, the message we're sending is, we're here with you. This is a safe place. You can do what you like in here within limit, but certainly there's limits to what's safe, what's not safe. And that's made really clear. But for the most part, it's encouraging kids to play out what naturally is coming to them, because what's naturally going to come to them are the things that they do need to kind of show us. I think another important part is learning how to interpret what they're showing us without putting too much onto it of our own personal interpretation. So that's kind of the skill. And that's why I think it's not mysterious, it's not rocket science, but it does take some practice to over time learn to sit with kids and kind of see the themes that come up over and over with kids, begin to sort of see what value they're putting to toys. They'll have a little collection, say, of the miniatures in my office of people or animals or objects they'll place in the sand tray, and it'll be a different scene each time. But some of them, I'll notice they'll take the same ones over and over again. So those are the ones I'm going to kind of watch because they've clearly assigned some sort of special meaning to those. Out of my room of shelves and shelves of stuff, a few hundred little things, they'll find the same ones. They'll zero in the shelves and find that one little object that they had the last time. So they think, okay, that's got some importance to them. So I'm just going to watch and see how that plays out. And a dollhouse is another real common item to find in the therapist, where they're playing out scenes through the dollhouse. Sometimes it's things directly that they've seen in the family. Sometimes it's removed a few times. I've had parents come in and say, oh gosh, they're really playing out this really violent scene. The baby was really slamming the mom or the other kids, and they're just really worried. And says, no, that's okay. It's not, they're playing out a feeling or an emotion. And better they're doing it through those little toys than actually going and slugging somebody. Kids are using toys, so they're using it as an expression of the feeling. It's a metaphor. It's not like who they are internally. They're not necessarily a violent kid, because in some play sessions, they're playing out some anger that they have. You really want them to have a way of processing that and getting it out into the open.
So the interpretation piece is it more of like a science, or is it more of like an art kind of thing?
That's a yes. That's a good blend of the two. Yeah, it's a blend of the two, and it makes it sound a little like woo-woo psychology. But when you watch kids and observe kids, the science, I think, and an art is building the safe setting, creating a safe, warm environment for kids, and realizing you will respect their feelings. You're not going to tell them what to feel. Think of what most adults, even well-intended, will say to a kid. Something happens, the kid says, oh, I broke my favorite toy, or my friend moved away, and it was so sad, and I was just crying and crying. And a lot of adults will say things like, oh, don't cry, it'll be okay. We're comforting them. But really, we want a situation where they can say, yeah, that was really sad. Yeah, most of us would have cried, kind of normalizing that it's okay to have these feelings. And then maybe if we went it a step further, we might suggest some activities to help kind of express that sadness. Your friend moved away. Well, what are some things we might do? You might want to you maybe want to see what the child is going to come up with, not what I would direct them to do. But are there ways of channeling some of those feelings into expressions that would help relieve some of that distress that they're showing you, or feeling or expressing?
So, okay, so kind of like the science aspect is just giving them the space they need, and the art aspect is maybe just not influencing them in a, like, sort of providing the correct level of interaction with the kids. So you're not, like you said with the trees, it's like you're not having them build a forest every time. It's saying, oh, cool forest, like cool trees, cool tree usage. I like, or something along those lines. So like when a parent brings their kid to play therapy, what is sort of like the value that they get out of it? Like, you're sort of working with them and you're watching them play. Maybe they have some sort of issue that is like mysterious to the parent, and their kid is having trouble. So what are you trying to help the kid like walk away from a successful play therapy session with?
So it's kind of a dual. You're kind of working at two things at once. You're giving the child the space to begin to work on whatever issues are going on with them. They will eventually bring them up in the playroom, usually sooner rather than later, because it's something that's bothering them. It's kind of troubling them at some level. But it may be something that is presented in more of a metaphor. It's not going to be, a little kid isn't going to come in and sit down and says, well, I think the main issue I'm here is because 3 years ago we had a car wreck, and I've had nightmares from that ever since. They're not going to be that articulate in stating things. So we're going to give them the space as they play it out over and over with the right therapeutic tools provided. That will begin to resolve itself, those internal issues, the concern or the worry. Say it was a car accident. So they're replaying the car accident, and each time there might be something else that you as the therapist might comment on, or they might highlight as a particular point that they got really frightened or something. And so then you're seeing them play that out a few times. So then you may make an observation about that. You've seen them do it several times. You're saying, man, they're really kind of stuck, aren't they? And that point, where the cars hit each other. And whatever it might be that they're presenting, you're making some comment about it. And then also they'll show some may begin to show some kind of emotional reaction to it, and you can make some comment there and saying that was really scary, just kind of being able to help them begin to articulate some of the feelings that they've been holding inside because they're really confusing. I mean, you talked about scientific. One of the real important aspects to working with kids is knowing child development and knowing developmentally where kids are and at what stage of development they are. So you have a better sense of, as they're playing out issues, particularly if they're using art or drawings, expressive arts, you have a sense of developmentally where they are, so you can kind of judge where they should be developmentally as they're doing these things. And that's going to have a big influence on how you would interpret the things that they're doing or how they're presenting information to you. Say a kid is 5 or 6, they're not going to have the same cognitive ability as a 12 or 13-year-old. If something traumatic happens to them, they don't have you think of a 13-year-old doesn't have a great skill set compared to an adult, but as far as being able to have a vocabulary and feeling words to use and be able to articulate experiences that they have a much broader range than, say, a 4 or 5-year-old who has such limited experience. They truly don't have the capacity to process a lot of traumatic material that happens to them because they're just because of the age that they are at the time.
So how much of this might not be like something you can put like a number on necessarily, but like how much of how much of the process really is like trying to normalize having difficult emotions in a kid?
I think there's some of it. You mean normalizing? How
Like
help me understand what you mean by normalizing it.
For instance, the example you gave where a kid would be sad that their friend moved away and the parents like, oh, it's cool, don't be sad, like trying to comfort them in like in a kind way, but it sort of encourages maybe not just feeling the feeling. Like, is that like a
Yeah.
very common thing you have to deal with in play therapy?
Um, I think where we say it occurs, where it becomes noticeable, is when something's happening with a child and it begins to interfere with their regular life, what we would call their normal life. It's maybe more coming from the other directions. Like you notice kids when they're not engaging in the world around them, or some behavior they're doing is interfere. Let's say it's a child who's really having trouble with self-regulation. They're going way up, way up the scale. And acting out or getting impatient or getting upset or angry. And it's beyond what's typical for a kid their age. And they're really struggling to kind of calm themselves, bring them back to a point that they can kind of self-regulate and calm themselves down. Well, you see that happening a lot. That's really interfering with their life, their quote, a kid's life.
Yeah.
If they're in the classroom, they're going to get in trouble because they're in school, and usually teachers don't have the patience to deal with one child compared to the 20 others that are there. We're seeing a lot with virtual, just kids having the patience to sit and look at a screen for 3 or 4 hours at a time. So you're seeing it when it disrupts their normal life, or other people around them are noticing they're not able just to engage in the things that typical kids that age can do. Then it's more likely to come to the attention of an adult. And it's almost like a lot of times we get kids are being brought at a point saying, we really can't take this behavior anymore. You need to fix it. And they're sort of brought in, and we have to sort of unpack it and explain and say, well, this didn't happen overnight, and it's going to take a little while to unpack this, to help sort out, to give this child a chance to sort of step back from what's going on, to work with them around what they think is happening, if they can tell us, to do those activities. I was talking about play therapy, which is usually seen as kind of a non-directive approach, where you sort of trust that the child knows what they need to do and will eventually work that out through the play. There are more directive approaches. I don't tend to be real directive in my work. I do a lot of what I think of as gentle directive, or I might set up a protocol of a session where there's initially some worksheet or activity or something I think is going to be beneficial to the issues this child is working on. If they're okay, if they're willing to engage in that, then we'll do that activity first. Then we'll do the free play after that. So you sort of set up the process. So there's a little more directive work going on. But again, these types of things take training, so you kind of know what you're doing. It's not a matter of just coming into the room and deciding one day, oh, I think we'll do child center today, and I think today we'll do directive. The child is really guiding you as you built your treatment plan and know what the goals are that you set up with the parents. Here are the goals for this child after we've discussed it and talked about it. These are the goals that we're working towards through the work that we're doing together therapeutically.
Do you often have a sense of like what is going on with the kid early on, or does it usually take a while, like a few sessions, or does it just purely depend on what the kid is and who they are and what they're dealing with?
I think, on the safe side, you'd say it just depends. Every kid's going to be unique. But yeah, there are general themes and things that you don't want to say that and then not really observe, not really be respectful of that observation period of doing an assessment with a child. If you're doing a play therapy assessment, that could take several sessions, maybe 8 sessions even to do a full assessment, or even 10. And that seems like a long time to spend, but it takes that length of time for a child to relax and begin to move around the room freely, or begin to feel confident. And a lot of it does depend on the personality of the child. You've got an outgoing kid, they jump in, they're off and running, they're not really hesitant. But if you have a child who's particularly anxious, they'll be really questioning. They'll come into the playroom, they'll see all the toys, but one thing a kid will do is they'll just ask over and over, what's that? What's that? What's that? It's like, well, you know what it is. That's a cow. That's a horse. That's whatever the little things are on the shelf. So they're not really asking me, what is it? They're sort of asking, is it okay to play with this stuff? It's like it's an unusual situation to come into in a room full of toys with an adult. So you're kind of judging from the child, taking your cues from them to see how quickly this is going to move, or what else you might do to put them more at ease.
So,
to get into the
play therapy is mostly used in children or with children because of their, like you said, like their sort of way of expressing themselves is through play. So that's is it kind of the primary, I guess, modality for working with kids would be play therapy? Like the other ones seem not to work too well, and play therapy is kind of like the
yeah, pretty much people using play therapy are using some activities. Expressive arts are big with kids. I mean, if you think about kids developing cognitively, that cognitive development kicks in at about age 12. And a lot of the kids we're working with aren't exactly, if they're coming in for therapy, or there's lots of issues going on, they're not exactly working at the same age level as we might expect them to be. So they may be functioning at a little younger age than 12 anyway. So the cognitive therapeutic stuff really kicks in age 12 or beyond. It doesn't mean we don't use any cognitive work with kids.
Mhm.
But you just get much further if kids are interacting with the toys and the environment around them. There's a real move now to incorporating a lot of nature into play therapy sessions with kids, using natural objects. We know that if kids are moving their bodies and interacting with the materials around them, it's integrating in more than if they're just looking at it from a cognitive level.
Natural objects like rocks and stuff.
Yeah, rocks,
Cool.
nature, yeah.
Yeah.
Rocks, plants, moving, being outside.
I used to eat dirt when I was a kid, so
yeah, see, you had your own little play therapy session,
So like over your career, has anything, this is sort of like something that just popped into my mind as we've been talking. Like, I mean, you've had, it sounds like a really interesting career doing a lot of different sorts of therapy, and you've ended up at this play therapy spot. Like, is there anything, did you have like a perception of what play therapy would be like coming into it, and having done it for how long you've done it, has anything you've not expected sort of like popped up about working with kids and using play therapy?
I think over the time, because I've been doing this for over 40 years now, often different types of mental health treatment. So I think it's just coming back to trusting that the process really does work. Sometimes, because it's kind of hard to sell this to a parent. Sometimes they'll come and say, all you did was play. They said all you did was play with toys.
Right.
And you have to kind of bring the caregivers and family along, because if you don't understand the process, it's frustrating to see. So sometimes there's a lot of pressure to get something done, to make this child have some kind of movement. And you might initially be working on some real, if there's some extreme behaviors, starting to kind of help manage those behaviors so that the child can stay in the setting that they're in. They're not going to get kicked out of preschool or kicked out of school. But often it's just building that space and trusting that if you do build a strong connection with this child, the relationship, and allow them the space to do it and help them by, just encouraging that without leading it, it really does work pretty amazingly. You see some really profound changes for kids. Um, but you've got to be patient. You have to kind of wait for it.
I mean, so you've seen things like, just like, I don't know exactly what a good example would be, and probably not. We wouldn't think of specific examples anyway, but you've just seen kids come in who are completely one way, and it seems like the parents are like, I don't know what to
Yeah.
do, and you're like, well, and you've seen these sort of things happen where the kid just makes a 180 and is back to being a regular kind of normal kid again, or not normal kid, but
Yeah, well, back to themselves, so
Yeah,
to
back to
speak. Yeah,
themselves.
back to who they. Yeah, over a period of time. Yeah, and sometimes it can go pretty rapidly. Yeah, particularly with younger kids, or if they don't have a severe trauma history. Let's say one event happens, sometimes that can be a fairly quick in its own way recovery. Of several sessions. The child's really working real directly on that and processing it, and it's like, oh yeah, they're not carrying as much emotional baggage as the adults around them are. So sometimes, younger kids can process something pretty quickly because they're not having to go through all these layers of other years of stuff, and they can say, yeah, this happened to me, and here's what happened. It was really scary, and they play it through. In the play, they're sort of overcoming. They're playing out maybe a battle scene where the good guy's going to win this time, or there's some scene that they get to kind of take control of the situation again through the play, feel like they're in charge again, feel like they were strong and powerful, like they're superheroes, have some mastery over the situation that before just felt like it was helpless. They were helpless in that situation from a kid's point of view.
Yeah.
So if they can play this out, and then while they're playing that out, you're also working on self-esteem and self-confidence, and some positive aspects of them along the way, so they reach a place where they feel, yeah, they can feel pretty confident again.
That's so interesting. Like, it's such an interesting form of therapy,
Yeah.
So you said that you really like the sand tray therapy
Mm-hmm.
because so could you talk a little bit about why you like sand tray therapy? Because I assume, like, if we're thinking about the different module topics
Mm-hmm.
that VCU offers, you might say that sand tray would be your favorite.
It is one of my favorites. I think just because it's one I still feel like I have more to learn about. There's two or three different models of using sand tray, and um, I just particularly like it. Send play therapists were kind of a cross between gathering all these little miniatures and collecting things, but it's almost like a fine line between play therapists and hoarders sometimes. You get to so it's kind of fun. You have all these great collections of stuff for kids to work with. Um, and therapists in our own training, we'll do our own trays. You kind of get immersed in that. You experience it for yourself, of kind of creating a scene,
Right.
building different elements into it, and then you might see something that you didn't realize before. It's like, oh, I put this, and this in the tray. When I see them together, it's like, oh my goodness, I see what that's telling me now. You get your own sort of self-reflection by using the tray, so that it's fun to watch other kids kind of they're even better at it than we are in creating a world, and then manipulating the things they put into the tray in their world. And in treatment, they'll go through phases. Most treatment goes through phases that you can recognize of, presenting initially what they want you to view as themselves in the world in the tray, and then kind of all chaos breaks out, and that's showing you where the issues are, the internal chaos is, and then through the tray they'll begin to sort of organize that again, and you see it begin to get organized and calm down again, and then elements of hopefulness or resources start to pop up in the tray. So through the work that they're doing metaphorically, you can see the progress they're making internally by working with these elements, working through the issues that they're bringing to you through the tray.
What do you like? So it's like to the uneducated outside observer, like the sand tray. I don't understand. Like, why sand? Why is it a?
I think it's just another medium. It's like in another ways it might be what kids choose to draw, or the dollhouse is another medium. It's what they can arrange, the figures inside of the house and set them up. It might be bigger toys. So for littler kids, it might be more active. I wave my arms around like, we use these like pool noodles as swords. You might be sword fighting with a little kid for a while, or you might have a lot of dress up clothes. Again, they're trying on different personas. For some kids, they're acting it out with the figures from the sand tray, just because there's a lot of ways to create stories with that narrative. Or they might use the dollhouse for that, or they might act it out with the dress up clothes and the dishes and the toys in the room itself, more actively involve themselves in that imaginative play.
I think it's interesting you say you mentioned stories, because it kind of makes me think that that's sort of what you're trying to get the kid to tell you, is like what the story is with them.
Yeah. We're a world that operates in narratives, that take the time for them to build the story, kind of the arc of the work that they're doing, and they'll do that through whether it's using toys or paint or clay. Some kids will do it through music or drama, others through the sand tray.
So, I mean, I've been to Child Savers a couple of times, and y'all have quite a few sand trays. I think there's like several rooms that have the sand trays in them with all the toys. We took pictures and stuff when we were there one day with the toys and things. So, but I imagine that the pandemic and making the shift to virtual how has that worked for your practice?
Well, we do have at Child Savers, we do have a couple of large playrooms, and then each of us have other toys, usually dishes for cooking, and army guys and superheroes for different types of play. But one of my goals, we had an opportunity through a donor to provide sand trays in every office. So one of my goals while I was there as a clinical supervisor was to be sure that each therapist got a basic understanding or training in sand tray, and then had a tray at their disposal. So we do have quite a few at the agency. Most of us have a tray in the office at this point. But we've always had a sand tray room too that's been set up and available. Just like we have actually one large and two smaller playrooms with a lot of different different items for kids to use. We have a lot of art supplies. We've got an art therapist on staff now, so we're learning a lot more about using expressive arts with kids, and have more supplies available for that medium as well.
During the
I'm sorry, I wandered off your question. The virtually, that's been a tough shift. We've had to kind of help parents create a setting, a therapeutic sense, recreate that safe place, only it's in their homes instead of in our office. So it's sort of redefining what that space means. And it's been harder in some ways. And for the majority of kids, I think they've made the switch over. Some kids just haven't been able to do it very well. They've really had a hard time engaging. And for those kids, we're not open yet, except for a very limited number of kids. We're now, a few kids are able to come into the building. We're limited to, I think, 7 clients per day. So that really limits the number that can be there on a regular basis. But we're taking the kids first that we already have on our caseloads that just aren't doing well at all in trying to use the virtual system. But we've invested a lot in learning different approaches, different methods of engaging kids through the virtual medium as well. We try to do a lot of sensory related things, like something you can do with your own child, very simple, the senses. You ask a child to name 5 things they can see, 4 things they can hear, 3 things they can smell, 2 things they can feel, and 1 thing they can taste. I think I reversed one of those. And that's just very grounding. If you go through that with a kid, they'll kind of go, if we do it, it's just kind of calming. And we're just grounding them in their own senses. So if we can get them to do that at the start of a session, it's kind of like they come into our office. They're kind of getting grounded to be in the space for a little while.
So for virtual, you're unable to do things like sand tray and some, I guess, the normal.
They have virtual sand trays now online. Yeah,
That
you
makes
could. They're
sense.
not as satisfying as the actual one.
Yeah.
And then it depends. Some kids, if they have their own toys, it's almost like you're doing sand tray without a sand tray. If they've got toys that they're arranging and building stories with, that's the same thing. They're just not using the medium of the sand. If kids have their own toys that they're creating stories with, that could be dolls, that could be stuffed animals, it could be puppets. There's lots of ways to create those narratives, whether it's with sand trays, with other items that kids have. It's like the narrative is there. If it needs to come out, we'll find a way for them to express it with what they have with them, hopefully.
Have you ever had like is it always like the kid expresses a narrative through play, like every time? And like, I guess if it goes successfully, like, is it always like a kid expresses themselves through a narrative with their play? Do you ever get a kid like who just like verbally expresses what's going on? Is that like pretty rare?
It depends on kids. I've got lots of kids that will sit and talk, that may be what they start with. And, we may be talking about something, and then something might get kind of hard for them to articulate. And I'll say, well, you want to try to draw it? Do you want to show me in the sand tray? You want us to use puppets? You can offer the different mediums that might make it a little easier. There are instances, that's always the question. Are there times that play therapy is not advised for kids? And sometimes if there's some kids with some intellectual delays, it might be a different form of play therapy. There's some kids who might have some limitations that limit their creative play, but they'll do their own form of that usually. It may not look the same as other kids' play. So you have to kind of know what's going on for them in particular to be able to sort of interpret. And for some kids, depending on what's going on, the lack of structure to it creates a lot of anxiety for them. For some kids, when I realized that was going on, I would have 2 or 3 particular things sitting out on the table when they came into the room. So they had something concrete to go to. Some kids, not so many, but there's a small group of kids that just need a little more structure to kind of get started. They just kind of freeze. They don't know what to do, For those kids, you do do a little more direction and say, well, today we're going to work on XYZ, and here are the things we have. You kind of give some choices between those things still, if you can.
But ultimately, it always just comes out in the play somehow.
Yeah. That's kind of the basic premise. Kids play, and there's a purpose to the play. It's not meaningless. Any play they're doing, it may just be for fun or silliness or, stress relief, but there's some purpose to it. We just don't know exactly what it is. And some kids, the play, the number of things in the room is too overstimulating, and they, they can't, it's too much, it's chaotic, and just flooding them. So that's another child I might take into a different room and bring a few things in with me, so they're not overwhelmed. They can see a few things to pick from.
It's such an interesting like form of therapy. It's like it's been cool to hear about because I never really like looked at it, I guess because I've been familiar with it for some time now.
Mm-hmm.
At first it was like this very kind of mystical thing where I was like, I don't understand how this is working.
Yeah.
But the more I learn about it, the more I'm like, it's an art, it's a science. There's like, people have degrees in this kind of thing. Like very precise in a lot of ways.
It truly is. If you think about all the things in the office, everything should be chosen. Everything, that's set out for that child to use for a sand tray or the dollhouse, it's selected. It has to have a therapeutic purpose. It's not just there randomly. And again, the different mediums like Play-Doh, so kids can manipulate things with their hand, kids that are tactile, clay. And also, if you talk with our art therapist, which could be another hour, she suggested different mediums depending on what issues there are for kids, certain mediums to use, whether you're using finger paints or pencils or clay or things, very precise. Some kids don't like to make messes, so you're kind of looking at what drawing materials they might prefer. There's a real art and science to that as well.
It's true. I mean, it's truly fascinating because I mean, I think, most people who don't have kids don't really think about what kids are up to. So it's interesting to hear like what is
Yeah.
being done to help kids who are having like a tough time,
Yeah, and it's very, it's very gratifying that way because kids will work it through play. That's their whole world. That's their job. It's how they interact with the world. So it's more than just play, but it's their way of connecting with the world. So it becomes really important if something serious is going on.
I think a lot of other people don't think of play as like of the play as like their sort of like method of expression or what they are, or like their work or whatever. It's like, oh, he's just like playing, kids just
Yeah,
playing with a fire truck.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I guess like what, so I think we are coming to the end of the questions, but I do have one that I hope this doesn't totally derail the discussion. I don't think it will. I don't think it's
Okay.
that insightful, but what has like the impact of all of like screen time and television and computers and iPads and iPhones had on like how kids play?
Oh boy, don't get
Like
me
over
started.
over the course of like you've been doing this a while, so like you've been able
Yeah.
to see like the shift.
Well, it's interesting. I think you have to really step back. There's not a good or bad. It just changes. And I heard a real interesting lecture several years ago that helped put that in perspective. It's like people say when we first started, we didn't have TVs or screens. Let's say we go back to the time of the radio when people, the only way they got their news was through newspapers printed, if you could read. If not, you listened to the radio if you could afford to have a radio. So that people organized getting together and listening. So you look at the different modalities of communication over time, and the same with toys. It just changes how they're interacting with the world. I've noticed in my era, a big shift from kids coming into the office and picking up things, and they always ask, "What does this do?" And I want to say, "Nothing. It runs on imagination." I mean, there is a real shift of kids expecting every toy to do something that they're just going to passively kind of watch it do something. Are they going to interact with it like it's a screen? So it is, I've seen that as a real shift. um, Lots of times in the playroom you don't necessarily want toys that have batteries or do a lot of things. You want the child to engage in creating that for themselves, creating that imaginative piece, working on their imaginative play, so that they're fueling whatever energy is needed to move that toy around in the imaginative play. You want them to do that. So I have seen it shift, and a lot is shifted to screens and shifting away from screens. I personally don't use a lot of screens in my office because virtually that went out the window. I had to use screens.
Yeah.
But kids will come in and say, okay, just turn on the computer. I want to look at this. And we'll say, no, in here, that's not available. In here, we're going to look at this. We're going to look at all these 5,000 toys that are here instead. So there is some redirecting of kids. And part of what we're treating are kids who are kind of addicted to the screen time and to the video games. And that is an ongoing challenge, therapeutic. We're talking with clinicians. How do you engage kids either through the video games or around the video games? And there's some people that have really invested a lot of work and time in developing therapeutic plans, for treatments working with video games with kids. I don't tend to do that, but I'm just not that good with technology. But I know other people that use quite a lot of screens in a positive way, a therapeutic way with kids. But yes, I think it definitely reshapes how kids think, how they approach the world. And again, it's not necessarily a bad or a good thing, but it definitely is reshaping their brains and how they think.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like makes you feel not positive, I guess, to hear that there are kids dealing with like addiction to screens and video games, and like at such a young age too.
Yeah.
That's
So I would, always be pushing for parents to get kids to get out, you hear this, but just to interact with their world outside of the screens, outside of the video games, to go out and play in the backyard, play in the mud, play in the dirt, play in the water. you
yeah.
know, there's, that it's still there, it's just harder. And also you have to look at places where it's safe to be outside, you know.
Yeah.
So looking at safe play places is certainly an important issue. Looking at all of our communities where there are safe areas for kids to play and to be outside.
Because I remember, I mean, something I've noticed is like when I was younger, there was like sort of limits on TV time. We didn't really have phones when I was that young. We kind of got phones when I was becoming an adolescent.
Mm-hmm.
And then now it just seems like it's so pervasive that like everybody has one anyway. And it's like, you can't get rid of it. It's just like,
Yeah. So then I think it is supporting parents and caregivers to do the best they can to limit that, or to interact in a way. There's ways you can go outside and do a scavenger hunt on your phone and out in nature. I won't know what they are, but like, was it the Pokemon craze where you could go outside?
Pokemon Go. Yeah.
Was that so that got a lot of kids out walking around. We would see some kids. You mentioned Child Savers. We had that nice lawn in the back, and that apparently was a location for some of those players. So you'd see kids going back and forth across the yard and holding up their phones, and they're out getting sunshine and they're finding their.
Which I guess on the positive note, that is like could be like a good therapeutic kind of. Like you mentioned, like some of your colleagues are working with screens in a positive way. So I guess, like you said, it's not good or bad. It's just, because I think people always want to like say that what the younger generation is doing is bad because it's not like what they were doing, and it's like, oh, boogeyman and stuff. But it's really just.
Well, like you're saying, it's just the difference in. Now kids, we used to have a more linear. Like when I was in college, I was in college before there were computers. So we went to the library, we found a book, we followed a very linear path to finding information. And I can't imagine kids today are just faced with this wall of information. They've got to try to pick out a few relevant pieces of information from just thousands and thousands of possibilities. That's just like a reversal of what we had. Again, it's not good or bad. It's just completely dramatically different. So how do they learn to discern out of this wall of information coming at them all the time? Begin to screen that out and lower the amounts that they're taking in and put some limits around it. And I think that takes some parenting support as well.
Yeah. Well, on that fairly mind-boggling note, is there anything that you want to add to this discussion? Anything you think has not been said?
Well, one thing we didn't really talk much about the courses themselves, and the point that we're doing the courses is to become a registered play therapist. It does require 150 hours of additional CE trainings, as well as supervision of clients over a period of time. So these courses are providing a way to collect the 150 CEs that you need over a period of time. With the specific topics that they need to be in. So in that sense, we're able to really be, hopefully, developing the next group. I don't know where it could go so far as to say next generation, because there's lots of people coming in at different levels of training. But the next group of play therapists coming out into the world. We need more play therapists. We need people to be registered and to be trained. Like you mentioned earlier, lots of people say, oh yeah, I'm a play therapist. I have a box of toys in my office. Well, that doesn't make you a play therapist. Just like having a box of art supplies doesn't make me an artist. It takes training, and it takes a lot of hard work and skill applied to achieve it. So I very much admire the people who are going through this coursework and putting in the time and the effort to learn how to do this, to work with kids in a more effective way.
Thank you so much for coming on the program, and I hope that everybody is listening, learn some interesting things. And there will we have play therapy workshops coming up in the future. We'll have some more information about that in the outro. And thanks for everybody listening, and I hope everyone at home has a good rest of their day.
Thanks again for listening. I learned a lot from talking with Jan today, and I hope you did too. A variety of workshops are available for registration, including Principles of Play Therapy, which begins on July 16th. Find out more and register by visiting ocpe.vcu.edu/playtherapy.